debut album from the Pretenders. So, segment number 3 of 3. In the opener, you heard Brass and Pocket, and now you're going to hear Tattooed Love Boys.
The mid-20 joys around her heart's black and blue petite love boys. I tore my knees up getting to you cause I needed to find out what the thing was for. I've been reading, man, the time came to explore. I went haywire cause I thought like I liked it. Little tease, but I didn't need it. But you mess with a good stall, you gotta pay.
All right, guys, so our first trip into the Pretenders catalog, and obviously because this is their debut album, the Pretenders were formed in...
You need some numbers, John.
I need some numbers, you're right, Matt.
So Pretenders comes in at number 95 in the 1980s, cracking the top 100 on Best Ever Albums, number 11 in 1980, number 631 of all time, and it did make Rolling Stone's list, coming in at number 152.
All right, so Pretenders were formed in March 1978. They have a pretty fascinating origin story, and they are an English-American rock band. Lead singer Chrissie Hynde is American, but the rest of the original band are British. Yep, so there you go. The lineup for the debut is Chrissie Hynde on vocals and rhythm guitar, James Honeyman Scott on lead guitar. He also does backing vocals. Pete Farndon on bass, and Martin Chambers on drums. So the Pretenders, you have to start, the origin story of the Pretenders has to start with Chrissie Hynde, because basically Chrissie Hynde, I read a good amount of her autobiography in preparation for this, and I mean, my gosh, what a life. She was like at Kent State when the Kent State shooting was there. She was... You know, we'll talk about where she was at in England at different times. We'll talk about the band she was a member of at different times. It was almost like Forrest Gumpian, that like there were all of these events, right? And like she was at these things. It was kind of like crazy. But I guess kind of the way to think of Chrissie Hynde is she was born in Akron, Ohio, and she was raised in a very straight-laced family, conservative family. And I think from an early age, Chrissie Hynde said she realized that was not for her. She was kind of destined to go her own way. So her origin story, and she was a little bit older when the Pretenders broke. She was in her late 20s, and then as it was blowing up, like her early 30s. So she was not your typical, 18 years old, break when you're 21 type story. So she actually experienced the summer of love, the late 60s. And so she went through that as a very young woman, and by her own admission, partook in all of it. The free love part, the drug part, the expression part, the nomadic lifestyle, and pretty much lived that life. And then in 1973 decides, okay, it's time to ship off to London. So she goes to London, and a friend arranges for her to get a job as a writer at NME, the rock music criticism magazine that was and it's not around anymore, but for a long time, all the way up through the 90s and even 2000s, right, it was a tastemaker in rock music in Great Britain. But she did not like the job. She felt that a lot of the people there were phony and sort of were framing narratives. And so she goes actually to work at the infamous Sex clothing shop that was run by Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood. And obviously, when you think of that shop, it's intrinsically tied to the Sex Pistols, because Malcolm McLaren ends up forming the Sex Pistols, and sort of the vibe it becomes, and that's where they found Sid Vicious. He was a patron of the store. But she did work there as well. So once again, like I said, very interesting that she worked at NME, kind of just randomly got the job without experience, and then worked at Sex clothing shop. Amazingly also, Chrissie Hynde was in an early version of both The Damned and The Clash. At one point in time, she was in both of those bands, as well as a lot of other bands. She had a goal of being in a rock band, right? It was there, but it just for whatever reason was not working out. But eventually she sort of stumbles into a demo where she's playing for a gentleman by the name of Dave Hill at Anchor Records. So he'd heard some demos of Chrissie Hynde in one of her, just loose songs that she'd written in just different bands and stuff like that. And so she arranges an impromptu band to record the songs. And in one of those crazy coincidences that seems to happen on CTS a lot, Phil Taylor of Motorhead was the drummer for the session. So he was actually in there and different stuff. So anyway, Hill, I think kind of shockingly based on her life, right, is the first person to kind of like see star potential in Chrissie Hynde, which, I mean, seems like it should have been more apparent, like it just seems like this person was there. But anyway, he sees star potential in her and he says, all right, go ahead and form a band. He tells her form a band. That's why you have to start with Chrissie Hynde, right? Because like it's her, right? And then it's like, all right, go form a band. So she finds Honeyman Scott and Farndon, and the original drummer is a guy by the name of Jerry McElduff. They record 5 tracks in July 1978 before they replace McElduff with Martin Chambers. And there you go. I've covered a lot of bands recently that had a ton of lineup changes, right? This band did not. There was that one lineup change, at least in terms of the early stages. We'll talk about later. But the final touch is they actually take the name The Pretenders because Chrissie Hynde has a boyfriend whose favorite Platter song is The Great Pretender. And that's how they get the name. So the band, one of the tracks they record is a cover of Stop Your Sobbing by the Kinks, which ends up on this album as well. That gets released as CD single in January of 1979. A couple interesting things about that song. One is that while they're touring America off of this album, The Pretenders, Chrissie Hynde meets Ray Davies, starts a relationship with him, and eventually has a child with him. So she covered him, and then that happened. A fun fact, Chrissie Hynde, after dating Ray Davies and having a child with him, it ends, and then she gets married to Jim Kerr of Simple Minds, a band we'll cover in the 80s as well, has a child with him as well. Neither of those relationships, unfortunately, last, though. Which kind of seems like on script for Chrissie Hynde, kind of with her independent streak. Second thing that might be interesting is that actually Stop Your Sobbing, including the version on this album, was produced by Nick Lowe, who we covered. Nick Lowe in a Cold Listen hot take toward the end of the 70s. But he decides not to work with the band because he doesn't see them going anywhere necessarily. And so he steps out and they bring in a new producer. And the album pretty much hits immediately. It's a pretty instant success. It hits number 1 in the UK and was a top 10 album in the United States. It gets certified as platinum in 1982. So that is kind of the Pretenders leading up to this. The band did make the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2005. The band's story is extremely sad, though. The band's only together for one more album after this before Honeyman Scott and Farndon both die within a year of each other, 82 and 83. Honeyman Scott of cocaine intolerance and Farndon of a heroin overdose. The Pretenders
cocaine intolerance?
It basically just a bad trip. Trip is the wrong word with cocaine. Bad,
Yeah.
It didn't go well that one time, right? Wow. And I believe Farndon had a heroin overdose and actually drowned. Basically in there. So all of the band members were heavily into drugs. I think these two deaths snapped Hynde into kind of cleaning up her act a little bit. I know that Honeyman Scott was a big one. He was an active member of the band when he passed away. Farndon had actually been kicked out of the band a year before his death because of his drug problems. So it's always interesting, like when everybody's using drugs, but one person is kicked out of the band, right? And so like you always think to yourself, like, was it because they didn't like how they were playing and that was it, or was their drug problem like epic even by the standards of those that were using? So that's a little bit of what's going on with the Pretenders. It got a little bit contentious later because Chrissie Hynde and Martin Chambers, the two remaining members, like he was in the band then wasn't and then would come back. There were a lot of other members of the group. I think Chrissie Hynde, even in her Rock and Roll Hall of Fame speech, kind of said, to some degree we've been acting like a tribute band of the Pretenders and sort of acknowledged, that's what it had been, but had mentioned how difficult it was to try to keep up the legacy of the band. So they were kind of like they had a little bit of supernova, right? They got big quick, and unfortunately, two big pieces of their sound were gone very soon. So there you go. I think I'll leave it there because I think that does a pretty good job of outlining it. I believe Matt is our first listen here, our first take, I should say. Thoughts on Pretender's debut album?
Yeah, so aside from Brass in Pocket, I didn't know any songs on this record. I actually didn't even know that Brass in Pocket, that was the name of the song. So when I first looked at the track listing, I'm like, I don't know any of these songs.
Really?
And then Brass in Pocket came. I was like, oh, that's what this is called?
That was the only song from this album you guys knew, Brass in Pocket.
You know what? Actually, no, that's not true. I knew Mystery Achievement. I knew.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
I didn't know that.
I didn't know that. I was agreeing with Matt because I didn't know the name of that song.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay,
Just
gotcha.
for some
Yeah,
reason.
I'm sorry. I forgot about that.
Weird.
Mystery Achievement, I did. Yeah, the last track I did know. So I did like this album. This was, I think, what I like the most about this album is how there's a lot of variety here. They're definitely, dipping their toes in a lot of different waters. But the main, I guess, influencing, musical genres I was picking up here it's like a cross between new wave and punk for the most part. It's got some, obviously Stop Your Sobbing. It makes sense. I didn't know that was a Kinks song, but that one stood out as kind of being like, oh, this is like an homage to, this like 50s doo-wop, 50s, 60s doo-wop kind of song. So they have that in there, but a lot of the songs on here are fast paced and they have like good grooves going on, and then there's interesting things like Space Invader, like that instrumental. I really liked that. That was just a really cool bass groove. And about halfway through, I'm like, this is just going to be an instrumental, and I was okay with that. I thought it was perfectly fine suited for that. I don't know how I feel about probably the most interesting song on here about I don't know if it's a love-hate relationship with it, or I just was going back and forth on whether I liked it or not, was Private Life. There were times I would listen to that song and I would be like, okay, this is really cool. I like this. And then there were times I would listen to it and I was like, I think I'm kind of annoyed by this repetitive bass line that's happening here. And it's like a 6.5 minute long song. It's the longest song on the record. And, I'm still not sure how. I think overall I like it, but there were definitely times where and I probably listened to this album, I don't know, six times or something like that. And I was definitely thinking at some points, I'm like, all right, I'm ready for this to be over. I'm not as into it. So that was kind of an interesting track there. But overall, pretty strong. I wouldn't say that I love the album, or it's just but I did enjoy it quite a bit. I like Tattoo Love Boys a lot. That was a good song to pick for one of the tracks here, John. I definitely like that. Precious is a great opening song. I like that. Mystery Achievement is another great song with a really cool bass line. I like the way that it ends there. I don't think there was any songs on here that I outright disliked. I thought that a lot of this was very good. So probably the best album that we covered this week, at least the most variety. And it's, you can kind of tell, this makes sense that that's in the top 100 of the albums that we're covering. And as a debut album, pretty strong as well. That's the other thing. It's, there's a lot of things going on here. It kind of makes sense that Chrissie Hynde was a little bit on the older side of a rock artist with their first record. Because the music is so varied, and I think was she the primary songwriter? It looks like she probably was, right?
Yeah, she was. She pretty much wrote all of them outside the covers.
Right. So, so there's you can tell that there's a maturity there. It's almost not quite as much as like when we covered Bill Withers, but it's kind of a similar thing. You come a little bit later, and there you can tell a little bit more of maturity than maybe a songwriter that starts when they're 18, 20 years old, something like that. So thumbs up here. Like I said, the variety is great. There's moments in here where I like the guitar tone where, I'm kind of getting some Police. I'm sure that was probably a band that they were listening to because I was picking up on some of their stuff. But overall, very, very, very good album. I did enjoy it.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. The first time I listened to this album, I was like, what's the big deal? I wasn't that impressed, but the more I listened to it, I really got into it. I'm with you. Chrissie Hynde's voice and delivery of her lyrics is kind of the immediate draw for me, and I think that's probably a lot of people's feelings. When you hear, I think Brass in Pocket's probably their most famous song. She has a distinct...
Back in the Chain Gang's a pretty big song,
too. Okay. But the point being, she has a distinct kind of delivery and way of saying things, and Brass in Pocket's kind of an example of that. And so and the other thing I really liked is her lyrics. I kind of equate them, maybe not as strong as Patti Smith, but there's definitely like a unique writing structure to them, and with her delivery, it kind of really appealed to me. I think the maturity factor comes in that Matt mentioned as well. She really doesn't. They're not always like right there in your face in terms of the lyrics. There's a subtlety there, and a depth in a song like The Phone Call, for example. I mean, it's like about like hitman or an assassin, but it's told in such a way that you wouldn't necessarily know that listening to it. Other examples of that are something like Brass in Pocket and
well, I mean, Tattooed Love Boys is about her gang rape.
Yeah.
Like, that she was gang raped by Hell's Angels. Like, true story. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Which she goes into in pretty stark detail. And an interesting take on it, by the way, too, which is basically like, well, when you play around with dangerous men, dangerous things happen, so I should have been a little bit smarter.
Wow.
Which got her a lot of scorn from people, but it kind of is her, you know? It's kind of her take. But that's what that's about, in case you're wondering.
Yeah. So that's an example, again, of like, you know, there being a lot going on in the lyrical content. And then apart from that, the guitars are really great in this, and I think that contributes to the overall sound and structure of the songs. I like the guitar in a song like The Wait, which is a great song, and Mystery Achievement, which I had heard before, and I forgot how awesome that song is. And pretty much throughout, the guitar is really interesting and adds an element to this that I really appreciated. I didn't know the Pretenders outside of their big hits, and this was impressive to me because I feel like, unlike Pat Benatar in my example, I feel like the other songs on this album that aren't the hits are also very good. So it's a pretty consistent album for me overall, and I'm interested to see what else, see what some of their other albums are like.
Yeah, I think you guys undersold this album, and this album's fantastic. Like, and I will be the first to admit that I think the context of doing this show chronologically is really helpful, because I get to know the landscape that these albums are birthed into. And I think when you just know the Pretenders post their influence, they just seem like another band that played right sonically like something. But James Honeyman Scott as a guitarist, his guitar playing is basically, you hear so many groups in the 80s and 90s that are taking his style of playing. He plays these really non-traditional leads, kind of, and he's got that like phased guitar is the best way I've heard it described. It's so influential for guitar tone and guitar sound in the 80s and the 90s, and it's the first time I'm hearing that guitar that is such a big part of 80s and 90s rock, especially 80s rock, but 90s too. And I'm like, whoa, here it is. First time, big. And I can't say enough about how much I like the guitar on this album. I think the Pretender, I don't know if I ever listened to this album in entirety. Like you guys, you guys kind of undersold, well, I think this is their big, they have I'll Stand By You, and they have all these massive songs. So they it's not like they're under the radar, right? They had a ton of like big, Don't Get Me Wrong is another big song that's there. But I think that the real surprise to me was that a lot of the songs I know from the Pretenders came after Honeyman Scott was gone, right? And listening to this album, I was like, my God, it was kind of like the B-52s, right? In which I knew Rock Lobster and I knew Cosmic Thing, right? And in Cosmic Thing, Ricky Wilson's gone, right? So that guitar that he's playing in the B-52's first two albums that we covered isn't there, really. It's just it's a different vibe, right? But then you go back and you're like, God damn, this guitar is fantastic. I feel the same way on this album. Chrissie Hynde writes fantastic pop songs or rock song. It like straddles the line between rock and pop because it's accessible. Like, it's crazy to hear something this edgy that could also theoretically be played on adult contemporary. Like, I can't describe how hard that is to do, to like have that line written. She's brutally honest in her songwriting. Like Josh said, you hear these songs and then there's this depth and personal disclosure that's like a Patti Smith, right? I actually kind of think Chrissie Hynde's story is a little bit like Debbie Harry from Blondie, another person who it took a little longer for it to break and who kind of had lived an interesting life before they got famous and, you know, dealt with trying to make it in a man's world, but also being a sex symbol of a sort. You know, they kind of were different, but right, they kind of had the same thing going for them, and they had a like kind of a like love hate, but more hate, you know, end of it. But it was part of their ethos. This might be my favorite album we've covered so far in the 80s. I really love this album. I didn't think there were any weak songs on this album. I thought the guitar, not only did I enjoy the guitar, but like I immediately heard the influential sonic palette of the pedal effects and stuff. There's just a ton of stuff that Honeyman Scott was doing that would be not appropriated, but homaged later. And that was the real shock for me. I also loved the bass work and the drum work. I thought it was very synergetic behind it. I think later it kind of became Chrissie Hynde and some guys, but this was definitely not that, right? She's got a presence, Chrissie Hynde, but the band is right there. You know what I mean? The band was right there with her in a way that later Pretenders albums, after those guys were gone, I don't know if you can say the same thing a little bit. It became almost like a Chrissie Hynde solo project. But yeah, strong recommendation for me on this one. I really loved everything about this. I thought it was strong from top to bottom. No weak songs. I like the music. I like the lyrics. I like the vibe. And I like the fact that this was such a surprise for me because I knew that I liked the Pretenders and I admired Chrissie Hynde kind of as an entity, but I had no idea this album was going to be as good as it was. And it's just awesome when you stumble into an album that you feel like you think you're going to know more about it than you do, and then boom, it hits you and you're like, yeah, this is top tier right here. So it's early, but this one's going to be revisited by me, I think, in some of my favorite albums of the 80s for sure. Yeah.
I wrote down Debbie Harry comparison also, that something about her singing reminded me of her. They don't sound the same, but there's a maturity and a power there behind them.
To me, there's a sexuality in it, but it's not a sexuality of like you're an ingenue or like men are deciding your sexuality. Yeah. It's like you're sexual and but you're in full, like maybe not always, right? But like at this stage of your life, you're in full control over exactly how much you're going to be sort of objectified, right?
Yeah,
and like
there's
it
a
might have been a
confidence there, I think, and that goes in hand with her lyrics and
and they both were victims of sexual assault. I mean, Hynde on many occasions, and Debbie Harry, of course, disclosed that she had been a victim several times as well. So I mean, that's an interesting sad but interesting parallel as well.
Yeah, you were sorry, Matt. Go ahead. John, you were very effusive and high on it. I'm high on this album too. I think you did a better job of describing why. But yeah, for me, this is like probably my second favorite album that we've listened to behind the Bowie album so far in my rankings. But yeah, I do like this album a lot.
Yeah, I think I kind of was, in listening to this, I was like, I think John's really going to like this, and I figured Josh would too, but I thought John was going to like it the most. It was kind of interesting because I do like it a lot, but I never found it like getting to that level that you're talking about, John, for some reason, and I can't really figure out why, because it does have a lot of things that I generally like, and I think it's very strong. But I don't know, there's something preventing me from getting to that next level, but it's definitely a thumbs up. And like I said, as a debut album, just the variety. I forgot to talk about Lovers of Today and Brass.
To you,
Lovers of Today is kind of like that's like a slower. I don't want to say, it's almost like it reminded me of more of a 90s song. Not like grunge, but there's like a menacing, not menacing. It's like a lower key, like a darker type sound, and it
Absolutely.
definitely reminded me more of a 90s type song. So I think that's just what I like the most. I was like, man, every song's different. It's its own thing, and it just all works together, put together. So it's strong in that regard too.
Here's a question for you, Matt. I know a lot of who your favorite bands are, right? And I know a lot of Josh and mine. Do you think that some of the barrier for you is that I don't think you have a bias against it, but there aren't many of your favorite bands that have like female fronted like vocals. Do you think that's a little bit of what it is? Because Josh and I are pretty effused. Like I probably in many ways have just as many female fronted bands as male, right? It's a sonic sound that works for me. And I think the more I know Josh as well, I'm not going to say because there's plenty of bands you like that female fronts, but do you think that's a little bit of what it might be?
I don't think that's the way it is with here. I think that was more of something for me with like Joni Mitchell, with Patti Smith. There were definitely elements of their voices that I did not like. I like Chrissie Hynde's voice just fine. There was nothing about her or her presence or whatever that was anything off-putting. So no, I see what you're saying, and that has happened before. But I would say with some artists, but not with these guys. I didn't find it here. No.
Gotcha. I just thought I'd explore that because I wasn't sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's plenty of other female-fronted bands, but I've thought of that before because I'm like, man, sometimes I kind of like crap on the highly regarded women, particularly those two that I mentioned, like Joni Mitchell and Patti Smith, but not here. I liked her voice just great. I thought it was great. Yeah, I like her.
I wonder too, maybe since you don't always pay attention to lyrics as much, like that was such a strong draw for me and John. Maybe that's
always going to be
the musical part didn't carry enough weight for you to make it rise higher.
Yeah, because that's always what I'm listening for. It's like I can't imagine listening to a song where the music is okay and the lyrics are so good that I'm like, I love this song because of the lyrics. Like that's just I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's going to be a very rare occurrence. So it's going to be the music is always going to be first.
Well,
and there was a lot of stuff going on here, but I wasn't taken to that next level, I guess. So
I like the lyrics plenty, but I actually like the music even more than I like the lyrics on this album, to be quite honest. There was a sound and the way the guitar work came together with the drums. I describe it always as like certain bands have a synergy of sound, and this album had that synergy of sound, which really speaks to me, where it feels like all of the pieces are pistons in like a well-oiled machine. And this album, it's amazing this is a debut album because it really arrived like fully formed to some degree. It doesn't sound like a band that's workshopping. It sounds like
right.
And really they were, because you think about it, really it's like a year from start to finish of when this was happening, but they sound like a way more rehearsed, tight unit than they had any right to be a year into their life.
Yeah.
Gotcha. All right, so thumbs up across the board on this one. Effusive thumbs up from Josh and I, and a confident thumbs up, but maybe not.
Actually, no,